It was a quiet morning on Relo's Prime, where the mist hung like memories, and the sky pulsed with the slow throb of a forgotten sun, and I had just returned from the archive halls, where whispers of ancient names still echoed, when the knock came sudden, steady, and hollow like bones against steel, and I paused, frozen, because no one knocked anymore. Not since the doorways became voice-bound and gesture-keyed. And that knock was the kind you heard in another age. The kind you heard when someone had something to say. That could not be spoken through airwaves or data feeds. And I rose and I walked slowly, because something had already begun to unravel inside me. And when I opened the door, there he was standing, as if the universe had looped backward, as if the tides of reality had curled around and returned something that had long been lost. He stood there in the coat I remembered, his boots dusty, his eyes impossibly young, and I knew those eyes because I had watched them dim. I had cradled his face in the trenches of the 5th lunar siege. I had felt his last breath in my arms, and now they looked back at me. With no recognition of pain, no weathering of centuries, only a question on his lips. Tavian, I whispered it. Not sure if it was a spell or a plea. Not sure if saying it would make him fade or shatter or fall into ashes. And he tilted his head slightly, the way he used to when I caught him off guard with something sweet or strange, and he said, "Yes, that's me. But how do you know me?" And I felt something deep inside me begin to tremble. Not fear. No, not fear. It was a terrible, beautiful disbelief. Like standing in front of a painting of someone you loved, only to have them blink and breathe and step from the canvas. And I asked, "Do you know who I am?" And he frowned, his lips parted, and then he said, "Your face is familiar, but I cannot remember from where." And I laughed, a sound too brittle to be joy. And I asked, "What year do you think it is?" And he said 2312. And I told him it was 2512. And he did not react with panic or denial. He simply looked at me and said I was on a transport to Cygna Delta. We hit an anomaly, and then I woke up outside the structure, and something guided me here. Something inside me pulled me to this door. And I told him, "You died on Cygna Delta. Your ship was lost in the foldstorm, and no one survived." And he shook his head once, slowly, and said, "I survived because I had to." And I asked why, and he said, "I think it was for you." He let me touch his face, and I expected cold. I expected the jolt of a phantom. But he was warm and solid and alive in every way that mattered. And I asked him questions that tangled around my breath, like vines. How do you not remember the fold? How did you get through the anomaly? How can your heart still beat the same when mine has broken 1,000 times since? And he only looked at me as if the answers lived just out of reach, like stars behind a veil. And he said, "I only remember wanting to return. I only remember needing to find something I had left undone. And when I saw you, knew this was it." And we walked through my home, through the quiet chambers, lined with artifacts of a life too long. And I showed him the photo, the one taken days before his ship left, the one with my arms around his shoulders, and his smile soft and private and real. And he touched the image with gentle fingers and said, "That looks like me, but I do not remember her." And I told him, "She remembers you, every breath, every second." And I wanted to scream, I wanted to collapse because he was here, and yet the part of him had mourned was not. And I wondered if this was a gift or a cruelty, and I dared not ask the stars which. I took him to the medcore in the city's underlayer, a place where the dust of centuries clung to the vents and the machines had seen more endings than beginnings, and they scanned him with beams and waves and particles that danced through his cells. And the result was a silence that pressed down on the room like gravity. And the physician looked at me and said, "His cellular age is 27. And I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it hurt. And the physician said, "There are no markers of stasis, no cryonic evidence, no time dilation fractures. It is as if he stepped across 200 years in a single blink, with no cost." And I asked, "How is that possible?" And she said, It isn't. And that's why I am afraid. And Tavian looked at me and said, I don't feel different. I feel like I've always felt. But things look bright, sharp, like I've been given a second sight. And I took his hand, and it fit just like it used to, as if no days had passed, no wars, no grief, no empty nights of silence. And I wanted to tell him everything and nothing, because he was here and I was unraveling, and I did not know how to hold him without falling apart. I took him to the memorial because I had to, because he deserved to see the stone carved with his name and the ashes buried beneath the roots of the firebark tree where I had knelt and poured all my anger and my sorrow into the soil, and he stood before it with the strange expression, not confusion, not fear, but a quiet mourning for something he did not remember. And he touched the name and whispered it like it belonged to someone else. And he asked, who put this here? And I said, I did. And he asked, why? And I said, because I loved you, and I lost you. And he said, but I am here now. And I said, yes, but you're not the same. And he turned and looked at me and said, maybe not, but the part of me that brought me to your door, that part has not changed. And I wanted to believe him. Gods, I wanted to, but I could still hear the last words he had ever said to me echoing in my head, and he did not remember them, and that made them mine alone, and that weight was both sacred and unbearable. I sent his DNA to the stellar record, and the response was immediate and coded red, and they summoned me to the core, and the overseers gathered around in silence and showed me the match, not just Tavian's identity, but Tavian's death, confirmed, archived, recorded in energy signatures and sensor logs that dated back 2 centuries. And they asked me how this was possible, and I said, I do not know. And they asked what I had done, and I said nothing. I just opened the door and there he was. And they debated in hushed tones. Because Tavian was a paradox, and paradoxes do not sit well with the universe. And one overseer said, perhaps he is a clone. And another said, perhaps he is a rift, echo. And a third said, perhaps he is something we are not meant to understand. And I told them, he is Tavian. That is all that matters. And they said, he cannot be allowed to roam unchecked. And I said, then you will have to stop. Me too. And I left before they could decide what to do, because I knew already that the galaxy does not tolerate mysteries without answers, and I would not let them tear him apart in search of one. We sat on the old sky bridge where we used to sneak away and count the transport lights and pretend each was a wish waiting to be spoken. And he asked me what kind of man he had been, and I told him everything. The way he used to laugh, like he didn't care if the world heard, the way he always tied his boots too tightly, because he said loose laces were unlucky, the way he kissed me like he knew time was against us. And he asked me what I had wanted to say before he left. And I said, I wanted to ask you to stay. And he smiled and said, I think I would have said yes. And that broke me more than I expected, because now he was here. But it was 200 years too late, and he put his arm around me and said, maybe this time I will. And the sky above us pulsed with the light of 1,000 stars that had died long before they reached our eyes. And I thought maybe love is the same. Maybe it burns even after its source is gone. The Corps sent their agents wrapped in black and silence, and they came with weapons that whispered and eyes that did not blink. And I stood in their way and told them he is not a threat, he is not a danger, he is only a man who came home, and they said he is an anomaly. And anomalies are to be studied. And I said, you will not touch him? Not while I breathe. And Tavian stepped forward and took my hand and said, if I am to be a mystery, let it be on our terms. And he kissed me then, not like a goodbye, but like a beginning. And the world seemed to hold its breath. And then he ran, pulling me with him, through the streets of the city we used to dream in, and the stars above us watched, and I swore I heard them whisper, run. And so we did, with every breath we had left.